Hello, everybody, and welcome back to episode 5 of the Saturdays Are for the Byzantine podcast. I'm your host, Professor Wren. Again, it's just a pseudonym, just a title I created by myself. Do not claim to be a professor at any university, nor do I claim to be employed by any university. Simply, if I were to teach this podcast series as a class, in all likelihood my title would be professor. So that's where we get that from. Before we get started, I want to remind you to go support us on our various social media websites. Give us a subscribe on YouTube. If you're watching on YouTube, subscribe, and you can hit the notification bell so you don't miss another episode. If you're listening on Spotify, give us a follow. And if you're listening on Apple Podcast, subscribe and give us a 5-star review. And then if you're listening on Google Play, follow us on there as well. Now we get into the content of today's episode, or this week's episode, I should say. It's a weekly podcast, which is going to be kind of a split podcast. We're doing, the first half of this lecture will be about Julian the Apostate, and then the second half of the lecture will be about the Cappadocian Church Fathers. Now, where we last left off our story, we left with the Emperor Constantius dying unexpectedly on his way to unseat his somewhat usurping cousin Julian in the west. Julian had been appointed general to go lead an army against the Alemanni in the west, while Constantius had been busy fighting the Persians in the east. And when Julian's army refused to march east to assist Constantius with the fight against the Persians, they declared Julian emperor, which made him, a renegade emperor. And so Constantius had to go try to deal with that, but he died on his way on the march to the west. So, we're left with Julian as the cheese that stands alone, and he becomes the new emperor of the entire empire, both east and west. Now, Julian would have been a more unlikely candidate for the imperial office because he's more of a philosopher, more professorial type than a general or a politician. When Julian was young, he was essentially locked away by his cousins, the 3 remaining sons of Constantine, who were Constans, Constantius, and Constantine II. There was a 4th son of Constantine, who, as you remember, last time we talked about, Constantine had him executed on suspicion of conspiracy. But Constans, Constantius, and Constantine II go on this sort of killing spree of various relatives in order to secure their power. They don't want other people around to challenge or possibly, form a conspiracy against them to seize power. And seemingly the only reason that Julian and another one of their cousins, I believe named Gallus, were spared was because they were so young. They're essentially not perceived as a threat. And so Julian is almost locked away, kind of kept out of the way for most of his life. He does receive a thorough Christian education as a child and young adult, and he even actually becomes a lector in a church, I believe it was in Nicomedia, where he becomes a lector. Now, if you're listening to this from the perspective of somebody today, is just somebody who gets up and reads at church. But back then, and until the Second Vatican Council, at least for Roman Catholics, a lector was a minor order. So you started out as a porter, as a small kid, and a porter was sort of like man the doors at the church, and then you moved up to acolyte, and then lector, and then subdeacon, deacon, and then eventually became a priest. So becoming a lector would have meant you're sort of contemplating life as a Christian clergyman, which is kind of ironic for Julian because, as his title suggests, I don't think I'm spoiling anything here. This history is over 1,000 years old. Julian is going to revert back to paganism, although he is raised Christian. So it's kind of ironic that he was in a position where he was, contemplating or in line for becoming a priest. And then as he grows older, he is exposed to more of the Greek classics like Plato, Aristotle, Socrates, which he develops a great love for, as we're obviously going to see. Right? These are the pagan Greeks who came well before, but inform a lot of Christian intellectual tradition. If you've read or heard at all about St. Thomas Aquinas, he is a big fan of Aristotle, and he actually refers to him in his Summa Theologiae as the philosopher. That's what he calls Aristotle. Had a big man crush on him, which, considering Aristotle was seemingly gay, I think would have been actually really funny for like Aquinas to meet Aristotle, and Aquinas being this kind of portly friar, just kind of like doting over Aristotle, and Aristotle just kind of thinking like, I wish he was cuter. Anyway, so as we previously mentioned, Julian had found some success as a general fighting against the Alemanni, who are a Germanic tribe who bordered the Western Roman Empire, and who frequently the Romans are fighting with the Alemanni along the border. And Julian's soldiers here refused to march east to fight the Persians from the request of Constantius. And it's at this point that Julian's soldiers declare him emperor. Now, in all likelihood, this is more so due to the fact that Julian's soldiers do not want to march all the way over to the east and fight the Persians. I doubt this was entirely based on Julian's soldiers' love and respect and admiration for him, although it's not entirely disregarded. I mean, he does win the campaign with these guys. Seemingly Julian liked to fight with his men in the front line. That's kind of how he'll meet his demise later on. So it is part of it, but I do think you also have to consider there's some other factors that are going on here as well. Now, obviously, Julian's claim to fame was his paganism. As we mentioned earlier, though he is raised Christian, he reverts to paganism as he gets older. And I don't wonder if in his chaotic childhood suffered at the hands of his Christian cousins, not uncles, at the hands of his Christian cousins, although all of his cousins are Arian Christians. None of them are Nicene Christians. But I do wonder if that may have left a sour taste in his mouth about Christianity. And also, living in such a chaotic childhood and his his clear love for the classics, perhaps that was something that kind of gave him a little boost in bad times, because it's undeniable that his young years had a lot of chaos to them. So Julian's goal as emperor is to get Rome away from being Christian and back to being pagan, right? So some of the things that Julian does in an attempt to revert Rome back to paganism is he revokes some of the tax exemptions which were given to the church, and some various other privileges which were granted to the church from the Edict of Milan. Julian also understood that the Catholic Church's set and visible hierarchy was an advantage to them. It's organized, there's a clear hierarchy, people understand who answers to who and who's leading who throughout the church, and paganism didn't really have something like that. So Julian attempts to make a pagan hierarchy to try to compete with the Christian hierarchy in order to better organize his pagan mission, essentially. Julian also reopens closed pagan temples, and he restores some of the land which was taken from other temples by the previous emperor, Constantius. Though one key thing here is that Julian refrains from persecuting any Christians. So he's not going back to the days of Diocletian or any of the previous Roman emperors who actively sought to exterminate the Christians. He allows them to still live unmolested, but he does actively encourage people to revert to paganism, and he does try to make it more difficult to live as a Christian. Although, like I said, Christians are not going underground with Julian's rule. Now, there's a number of problems that Julian encounters in trying to revert the Roman Empire back to paganism. And one of the biggest issues is that any zeal or excitement for paganism had basically died out in the Roman Empire. Now, there's a number of reasons why paganism had basically no zeal, no growth to it, and Christianity had all the zeal and was really growing at an almost exponential pace. So the first thing to consider is that about half a century had passed since the issuing of the Edict of Milan, which tolerated Christianity in the Roman Empire. And so this means you have half a century where Christianity has been tolerated and not persecuted. Pagans and Christians are probably living with some level of toleration towards each other, living next door to each other, sharing an empire together, and this is going to normalize Christianity and decrease any resentment between the two groups. So it's not like the pagans are so resentful of the Christians that they're going to try to drive them out of the empire like people were trying to do with Diocletian and those previous emperors. And as I say, all of the zeal was with the Christians. Now, when I was writing this lecture, I was thinking about, well, what might some of the reasons be that Christianity is spreading and paganism is just sort of stagnant and honestly a slow but steady decline. And part of something I was thinking about was that Christianity had to actively spread itself across the empire. There's an evangelization involved. Now, I've never heard of pagan missionaries going out and evangelizing and preaching the good news of Zeus to a new group of people who have never heard of it before. Now, I'm more than happy to hear about it. If you'd like to leave a comment on the YouTube video, you can search Professor Wren on YouTube, leave a comment, and you can tell me about something you know about this. More than happy to read about it and discuss it with you guys. But as far as I know, at the very least, it's not common, right? But Christianity, on the other hand, has an active group of clergymen, active group of priests who are going as far and wide, well beyond the borders of the Roman Empire. For example, St. Thomas the Apostle is believed to have gone all the way to India and established a Christian community there. So that gives you an idea of the missionary zeal that's going on with Christianity in this time period. There's a lot more excitement for it, and the excitement for paganism, if there was ever an excitement for paganism, obviously it was the status quo for centuries. But any excitement for it does not exist by this point in time. And then you also have to consider as well that Christianity was already growing before persecution ended. So during persecution, Christianity was already growing at a decent clip. But then when the persecutions ended, it really unchained the church and allowed it to really spread its wings and fly to new heights. Another issue for Judaism, I just combined the words Julian and paganism. So the other issue for Julian's pagan project is the diversity of paganism within the Roman Empire. There was no one pagan religion that existed across the Roman Empire. There's a wide variety of different pagan cults and religions which existed throughout the empire. Some cults focused more on the sun. Some were considered military cults. Regional differences. Egypt might have a different form of paganism than Greece, and might have a different form of paganism than Iberia. So there's no real one common faith or one common cause to unite people around. Whereas with Christianity, although there's heresies, the church is trying to put out one true faith through the various councils, which just does not exist at this point with paganism. One final note on Julian's attempted pagan revival is, I think, a significant mistake that he actually makes in this project is his tolerance. So, because he did not persecute Christians the way, say, Diocletian did in the past, Julian fails to provide any actual reason for Christians to abandon their new faith. And let's keep in mind that for centuries in the Roman Empire, Christians were literally killed for their faith, often, dragged off to the lions in the Colosseum, and they're still not reneging. They're still not giving up their faith. And so Julian seems to be under the impression that some vague threats and loss of privileges is going to make these people abandon their faith, which is a real miscalculation. Again, people were dying brutal deaths for their Christian faith in previous persecutions. And so loss of tax-exempt status is nothing. That's like a stiff breeze in the face instead of getting punched in the face. So this is a real miscalculation. And you need to give people an incentive to do more than just the minimum of what you're attempting to get them to do. So the way I think about this, right, so I'm a teacher. I think about this from a teacher's perspective. If you're a teacher, or if you deal with students in any way, if you're a parent and you have school-age children, you'll understand this analogy that I'm about to use, right? So if I'm a teacher, I am a teacher, and I assign a 3 to 5 page paper to students, what are 90% of the students going to turn in? Maybe even 95% of the students going to turn in. They're going to turn in a 3-page paper, the minimum requirement. And then maybe 5 to 10% of them will turn in 4 to 5 pages, right? So people are not going to change or do anything that they don't have to do, especially if you're not forcing them or providing some kind of serious negative ramification for them if they don't do that thing, right? And again, Christians suffered horrible fates under previous Roman emperors, and so a loss of church's tax-exempt status is nowhere near the incentive to get people to abandon their faith. Now, Julian, as a good classicist, was a real admirer of Alexander the Great, and he fancied himself the second coming of Alexander, which is quite a stretch for someone who had only won a handful of military victories and never previously served as a soldier himself, who's only given an army by his cousin because he was of the imperial family. But nevertheless, in order to prove himself the new Alexander, Julian planned a full-scale invasion of the Persian Empire to be just like Alexander. Now, though Julian possessed a great intellect, and he certainly had a knack for philosophy, military planning did not seem to be his strong suit. His plans seemed to entail marching directly into the Persian Empire, and he didn't take towns and cities along the way and build a line of supply, a base of operation, lines of communication back to the empire. No. He marched from the border of the Roman Persian border, which was in what would today be like northern Iraq or Syria, almost the border between Iraq and Syria. He marches all the way down through what would be modern Iraq between the Tigris and Euphrates River. So he's basically boxed himself in, right? He's got a river on either side of him. So if he's, in a situation where he needs to get out of Dodge, he's got a river on both sides of him. So that's not exactly the best tactical decision. But he marches right to the Persian capital of Ctesiphon, or Ctesiphon, kind of depending on your pronunciation of that, and he besieges it. And his idea here is he's just going to take Ctesiphon. And that's how he's going to win this campaign, is by taking the Persian capital. And just as a point of reference, Ctesiphon is near where Baghdad is today in modern Iraq. Now for a little bit of source material, I recently purchased Warren Treadgold's Concise History of the Byzantium. Warren Treadgold is a professor of Byzantine history at St. Louis University, which is, St. Louis is really an excellent place for medieval and Byzantine studies. Obviously, Dr. Thomas Madden is there, who's an excellent Crusades historian. I don't attend St. Louis University as a graduate student, although when I was thinking about that more seriously, St. Louis was definitely at the top of my list. But regardless, I'd like to read to you now for a minute an excerpt from Warren Treadgold's A Concise History of Byzantium to relate what happened with Julian's campaign against the Persians. So, Treadgold says, quote, "Since the empire was at war with the Persians, Julian hoped to win a great victory against them to vindicate his faith," his pagan right. So if Julian wins this campaign, it will be a validation that his pagan faith is greater than the Christian faith. Though the Persians were ready to make peace, he continued Constantius's preparation for war and assembled a vast army of some 60,000 men, probably including most of the field armies of the whole empire. Julian planned to lead the main force against the Persian capital at Ctesiphon, while a detachment under his relative Procopius was to collect some Armenian allies and link up with him from the north. The expedition set out in 363, and Julian advanced as far as Ctesiphon, carrying all before him. But Ctesiphon looked impregnable, and Julian, misled by some Persians who claimed to be deserters, turned north to look for Procopius. Dogged by the Persians, who stripped the country of supplies, the army had already become exhausted when Julian received a wound, probably from a Persian spear, and died of it. I did mention that he did like to fight in the front line with his men. Julian was not, seemed to not be the type of general who sat on a hillside nearby and moved chess pieces around on a battle map. But regardless, so Julian dies on this campaign, and his generals offered the throne to the pagan prefect Sallustius, a friend of Julian's, but his refusal, nominally because of his old age, may have shown his opinion that with the expedition's failure, the pagan cause may become hopeless, at least for present, right? Because people are going to view this pagan project as a failure because the campaign was a failure, and if Julian had the favor of the gods, his campaign would have succeeded, but it did not. So this kind of gives an indication that he did not have the favor of the gods. The soldiers then proclaimed the Christian guardsman Jovian. Eager to extricate the hungry and demoralized army from Persia safely, he made a moderately unfavorable peace with the Persians, ceding part of the border zone in Mesopotamia, the Roman protectorate over Armenia and Iberia. He rescinded Julian's anti-Christian measures and set out for Constantinople. But in 364, Jovian died suddenly in the middle of Anatolia, and the army had to choose an emperor at once. It proclaimed another Christian guardsman, Valentinian, but also insisted on naming a colleague for assurance against another open succession. Valentinian chose his brother Valens, assigning him in the east as far as Thrace. The portion Constantius II had ruled early in his reign. Valentinian kept the rest of Illyricum, the homeland of both brothers, which was enough to make the west the larger part of the empire. So that's where we get to Valens and Valentinian, who you may know from the disastrous battle for the Romans, the Battle of Adrianople. But that is where we are going to leave the more secular-themed history behind, and we are now going to turn to more religious history with a look at the Church Fathers, specifically the Cappadocian Fathers. So the second part of this episode, as I said, will be dedicated to several Church Fathers, better known as the Cappadocian Fathers, and there were three of them. Their names were St. Gregory of Nyssa, St. Gregory Nazianzus, and St. Basil the Great, who St. Basil the Great was the older brother of St. Gregory of Nyssa. Now, let's just pause here and imagine for a moment what was going on with the parents of Basil and Gregory, that they produced not one, but two church fathers. One set of parents produces two church fathers. Now, I don't know what Mr. and Mrs. of Nyssa were doing, but clearly they were doing something right if two of their children ended up being fathers of the church. That's incredibly impressive. Now, these are not the only church fathers we're going to examine during this podcast lecture series. We'll examine other, so there's kind of two groups. There's Greek fathers, more Eastern fathers, and then there's also Latin fathers. Now, some church fathers are recognized in both the Greek and the Latin tradition. Some are only recognized in one or the other. Now, the ending of state persecution by Christianity, as we mentioned earlier, freed the church to experience actually a flowering during the 4th century. And a number of these church fathers are popping up during the 4th century, and the Cappadocian Fathers are some of those. Now, they're called the Cappadocian Fathers, if you don't know, because they come from the region in the Roman Empire called Cappadocia, which is today would be in modern Turkey, sort of east-central region of Turkey today, which would be called Asia Minor back during antiquity. Now, there's a number of common themes across the Church Fathers, not just the Cappadocian Fathers, and I think it's worth examining some of these commonalities between all of them. Number one is that all of these Church Fathers, with the exception of St. Augustine, come from noble families. So this means that Christianity is well established in the Roman nobility at this time. It's not new to them. There's seems to be at least one generation of Christians in much of the Roman nobility. And we can also tell this because all of these church fathers were cradle Catholics, so meaning that they were Christians from birth and they did not convert during adulthood. They were Christians from the time they were babies. And a number of them also seem to have a very close relationship with a woman, usually their mother, who had a great influence on their faith, really bolstered their faith. They all extensively studied Greek and Latin, so they're well versed in the classics. Most of them had secular careers before they entered religious life. So, for example, a lot of them worked as state bureaucrats. In particular, example I can think of is St. John of Damascus. Was a bureaucrat in the Arab states, in the Arab Muslim states. Although he was a Christian himself, when the Arab Muslim states first take over much of the Eastern Roman Empire, the government infrastructure is still staffed by a number of Christians because at that point in time, there are not a lot of highly educated Arabs, and they also don't, they have different government structures. It's easier to keep the government structure that's in place there at the time. And so the best educated people and the people who best know the structure in place at the time were the local Christians. And so you see for a couple of centuries, it's the case that these Arab Muslim states are actually, in many cases, run by Christians, although the ruling class is not Christian themselves. Most of the church fathers also lived as monks, and the monastic tradition also grew significantly at this time. So monks going out and living in monasteries, kind of away from cities, to kind of get away from city life and to focus more on religious life, prayer, contemplative thought, etc. With the exception of St. Jerome, all of these church fathers produced some of their most important work as bishops. Now, St. Jerome was not a bishop, or perhaps he was, I shouldn't say that. But St. Jerome produced the Vulgate Bible, which was the translation of the Bible from the original Hebrew and Greek into Latin. Now, previously, there had been translations of the Bible into Latin, but the issue really came with the Old Testament, that in those Bibles, the Old Testament was translated from Hebrew into Greek and then into Latin. What St. Jerome did, so you lose a little in translation there. And so St. Jerome goes directly from the Hebrew to the Latin to get a closer one-to-one translation of the Old Testament into Latin. And now this Bible is called the Vulgate, not because it's vulgar, not that it uses like naughty words that you can't say on television, but Vulgate in referring to the common language, right? So in the Western Roman Empire, Latin is the common language. So he's trying to write a Bible that's more accessible in a more vernacular language in the Western Roman Empire. And who says that Catholics don't want people to read the Bible? I mean, come on. And number 7 is that all of these church fathers had a massive literary output, meaning they wrote a lot, like almost like their job was writing, which in part it was. So now that we've gotten some generalities out of the way, let's get into some specifics. So we'll start with St. Basil the Great because he has the greatness title. And so we should start off with the great one. So St. Basil was known for having a bit of a temper, also known as a fighter, and had a reputation for just getting things done. He fought heresy, as I mentioned in our podcast about Arianism. Although Arianism is condemned at the Council of Nicaea, it doesn't go away overnight. And so the Cappadocian Fathers are still dealing with some of the remnants, the remnants of the Arian heresy. And so that's part of their legacy as well. St. Basil also establishes a monastic rule for Eastern Orthodox monasteries. So a monastic rule is simply the rules by which monks live when they are in monasteries. If you've ever heard of the rule of St. Benedict in the West, this is very similar to it, just in the East. St. Basil served as the bishop of Caesarea Eusebia, and as bishop, he advocated for other Nicene clergy to be promoted to become bishops as well. Now, when I say Nicene clergy, This is a way to distinguish Nicene Christians, so Christians who follow the Council of Nicaea, from the heretics, the Arians. So a Nicene Christian follows the Council of Nicaea, which is the mainstream Orthodox Catholic church and teaching positions. And when I say, it may sound confusing, I'm saying Orthodox and Catholic, you're thinking, oh, aren't those two separate churches? No, when I say Orthodox, I mean like Orthodoxy. I don't mean like Eastern Orthodox. And St. Basil also wrote a treatise on the Holy Spirit, and he used the liturgy to back up his treatise, kind of emphasizing the third person of the Trinity, which is God the Holy Spirit. So how did he use the liturgy to back this up? Well, at the beginning of Mass, he started using the sign of the cross, which obviously invokes the Holy Spirit, right? In the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. Because St. Basil understood that prayer and worship inform faith, right? There's the old saying, lex credendi est lex orandi, which means the rule of prayer is the rule of faith, sort of prayer informing faith. Let me move on to St. Gregory of Nyssa, again, the brother of Basil. Gregory of Nyssa specialized in what's called speculative theology, and all this means is it's theology not based on natural observations. So it's more of a metaphysical. It's more not based on things that you can physically observe, things that are more abstract. That was the word I was looking for. A comparable thing to this in the West is if you've ever heard of St. Anselm, if you've ever read St. Anselm, this is more along the lines of what Gregory of Nyssa was known for. If you've never heard of St. Anselm, I would recommend reading it, although don't feel bad if you read it like 3 times and you still have no idea what he's talking about. I think it took me to about the 4th time reading our assignments of St. Anselm in college before I really understood what he was saying. So it is rather dense, and it is kind of difficult to grasp. St. Gregory of Nyssa was the Bishop of Nyssa, and he also contributed to Nicene Christianity, fighting Arianism and promoting the Nicene Creed. He wrote a commentary about himself and his sister and their relationship. So as you can see here, this is an example of the important relationship with women playing a role in these men's faith lives, in their faith, right? So obviously his close relationship with his sister is going to have some influence on his faith. Now, one point, Gregory also was contemplating what is the purpose of life. And his conclusion was that the purpose of life is to love. And now in the gospel, you can find some support for this, right? They asked Jesus once, what is the greatest commandment? And Jesus responded with, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, and strength, and your neighbor as yourself. So you can see there, Jesus is giving you what the 2 most important things to do are to love God and love your neighbor. So I don't think Gregory of Nyssa is too far off in his thinking here. Not that he needs my confirmation or anything. I mean, I'm a nobody compared to a church father, for goodness sake. Now we move on to our last one, St. Gregory Nazianzus. Now, St. Gregory of Nazianzus was the Archbishop of Constantinople. He also greatly contributed to Trinitarian theology, so the theology of the Trinity, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, which continue, and his work continues to shape modern theologians even to this day. St. Gregory Nazianzus also started to produce a mix, sort of a blend of Hellenistic philosophy into his teachings. And obviously, Greek philosophy is going to have a real influence on Catholic theology moving forward. Obviously, Aristotle and the natural law are going to be seriously incorporated into Catholicism as time goes on. And Gregory also kept a record of his sermons and even his poetry. And that is where we are going to wrap up this week's episode of Saturdays Are for the Byzantines. If you've made it this far into the podcast, want to give you a big thank you. I appreciate every viewer and listener I have in these early stages of this project. All 5 of you listening out there, hopefully the numbers start getting better as time goes on. And if you have made it this far and you're listening on YouTube, make sure you like the video, hit the subscribe button, gently tap the notification bell. If you're listening on Spotify, give us a follow. If you're listening on Apple Podcasts, please subscribe and give us a 5-star rating. Only 5-star ratings are allowed. And if you are listening on Google Play, follow us there as well. Thank you for listening, and make sure you tune in next week. And I'll see y'alls next time.